we're going to create a CRUD application built on top of MongoDB. Specifically, we'll build a ticketing system, the ability to create, read, update, and delete individual tickets. MongoDB is a non-relational database. It accepts whatever data is passed to it, which means that as we create our application, we will provide structure on our application level. As our data needs change, we can change it on the application level without needing to modify the database. Budibase can integrate with all types of data sources. Let's dive in to show how we get up and running with MongoDB inside of Budibase. As always, we'll start by creating a new application. We'll start from scratch. We'll call this our Mongo Ticket app. And we won't include the sample data. I'll create this app. And the first thing I'll be asked to do is to select my data source. So this is going to be MongoDB. So I'll click on MongoDB, which is a non-relational data source. And I need to give my connection string. Now I'm hosting my MongoDB instance locally and my Budibase instance in a local Docker container. So I'm going to replace this local host with host.docker.internal. And I need to give a database string. Now with MongoDB, if the database doesn't exist, it will be created when we start querying it. So I'm going to add a ticket system here. And I don't need to go to MongoDB to configure that. I'll click Save and continue to query. Now I need to create a list of queries that I'm going to use in my design layer. So I need to be able to create an individual ticket, to read all the tickets and read an individual ticket, to update an individual ticket, and delete. So there are 5 queries that I need to create here. So let's go through those one to one. The first we'll do create new ticket. This is going to be a create function. It's access level, so who can create? Well, I'm going to leave this a basic, so anyone who's authenticated. Which collection do I want to use? So I'm going to say tickets. And which query type is this going to be? It's going to be an insert one. So there's information I want to pass in to this ticket to be able to create it. In a relational database, we might call these columns. In MongoDB, we'll refer to these as fields. So I want to track the customer name. I'll track the issue, who it was resolved by, the start time, the end time, what the resolution was, and the current status. So by creating these as bindings, I will be able to add these data dynamically through the front end of my application. So we can assume that these values exist because we're going to link them later on. So now in the query, I need to return an object that maps the field names in the MongoDB database to my bindings. So I'm just going to do all of those again. So I'll do customer name is mapped to the binding of customer name in quotes. So I'll put the quotes in. And inside the quotes, I'll do the binding, customer name. So when this query is processed, this customer name will be dynamically bound to the value that's here. Just do that for each of the rest. So I filled in each of the fields with some default values, which will create this record. When I run the query, I get back an acknowledged equals true and the ID, insert ID. So I'll click on Save Query now, which will make it appear on the left-hand side here. And now that'll be available at my front end. So create. The next one I want to do is to read. So I want to read all of my records. So get all tickets. This is a read operation. Again, I'll leave this as basic. We're doing this from our tickets collection. And this is a find operation. This one doesn't need any fields and it doesn't need any bindings. I'll run the query and it will get the data that I've added into my database. Shows me the first record here. If I click preview, I get a list of all of the records that exist so far. I'll save that query and get all tickets is done. Now to read an individual query. So get one ticket. Again, this will be a read with an access level of basic. Again, we're looking in the tickets collection, and this time it's a find one. And I want to bind this to the ID of the ticket. So in MongoDB, the ID is automatically stored in an underscore ID field. And I would like that to match the ID that I've bound above. Now the slight problem is that this needs to be of a specific data type. Although it looks like a string with some numbers and letters in it, it needs to be cast as an object ID for it to be compatible with MongoDB. So I'm going to wrap this binding of the ID as an object ID and put that in single quotes like that. So if I run the query now, I get back results empty. Please execute with results to create your schema. So if I open up my get all tickets again, run this and just grab an ID of one of the ones that had some data in it. I'll set that to the default value, so when I run the query, I get some data back. And in that way, Budibase can build up an understanding of what fields we're expecting to have here. So it's at this point that we can look at the start time and we can cast that to be date time, and the end time that we can cast that to be date time as well. And we can change any of the schema that we would like when we're representing our data, and we'll click on Save Query. If we change our minds and decide to have different data on our fields here, we'll choose a document from our database that has the fields we want. We'll run the query again, which will regenerate the schema, and then we'll save our query. So while MongoDB is structureless, we are imposing a structure from this data layer. We've created, we've read, we need now the ability to update and delete our records. So let's update first. So I'll click back in MongoDB, add the query, and we want to update one record. This will be an update operation. The access level again will be basic. We're looking in tickets, and this is an update one. So now again, I want to provide binding so that my front end can pass the updates back again, and I then need to write the query. So the fields we had were customer, issue, resolved by, start time, end time, what the resolution was, and what our current status is. So the query for an update is represented by two objects. The first object is how we expect to be able to find the record we want to update. And the second object is how we want to affect our changes. So in the first instance, we'll want to pass the ID. So I'll need to capture the ID as a binding and then do exactly what we did with the read. We'll say underscore ID should be object ID of the bound ID. So that's going to allow MongoDB to find the correct record. And now we want to pass our updates. So I'm going to use the set operation, $set, and again, match the fields like we did for our create operation. It looks exactly the same. So customer name is being mapped to customer name, issue is being mapped to issue, resolved by is being mapped to resolved by, and all the way down. I'll run this query and it says executed correctly, acknowledged is true, modified count 0, upserted count 0, and matched count 0. So that's what we'll get back for this update operation, and I'll click save. So I've created my new ticket. I've got all the tickets. I've got an individual ticket. I've updated a ticket. And the last query I want to add is to delete a ticket. So delete one ticket. This has got a function name, delete. Set the access level to basic. And again, our collection to tickets. The binding from the front end here is going to be the ID. And we'll use exactly the same query as we did for our getting our individual ticket. So we'll underscore ID will match object ID of our bound ID. So if I run this query, it's going to say that the action type is undefined. And that's because if I scroll to the top, I see I've forgotten to add a query type to delete one. I'll also go and get a default ID from somewhere else in my database. I'll run this query and it will execute successfully, showing it's acknowledged true and no records were deleted. Let's save that, and we have our 5 queries to build our front end with. As our data needs change, as we want to add or remove fields, we'll do that on this data layer here, updating our queries and imposing the structure that we want onto the unstructured MongoDB database. Let's dive into the design layer. And we're going to follow that same pattern. We're going to create, read, update, and delete. I land on this home screen. And in here, I'm going to add a form. Now, I'm adding a form rather than a form block. A form block does some of schema interpretation to be able to create the form and some other bits and pieces. And it only works with structured data. So we're going to click on form instead. I'm going to call this a create new ticket form. It's going to be of type create. The schema I'm going to match to my create new ticket query, which means when I create form fields, it will allow me to select those with a drop down. I'll leave the size alone and I'll leave it as enabled. So inside of here, I'll create a headline. I'll just say create new ticket as both the name of the component, which will appear on the left, and the actual text that will appear for my user. I'll then add a text field. So I'm searching at the top and finding and clicking here. And it's going to start interpreting from my schema. So this will be my customer name. I'll set that to the field. I want a slightly more readable version of the label here. Customer field. I can click on the component and press Command D or Control D if you're on Windows, which will duplicate the field. And then I can change it and stick to the next field. So customer name, then issue. Just rename the fields. Select over here on the left, Command or Control D, update for the next field. And I'll do it for the rest of the fields. So once I've got all the forms for my field, I'll add a button at the bottom, which is going to submit. I'll name it. I'll put some text on it to add. I'll maybe give it some padding, margin at the top, so it sits away in the table a bit better. And I'm going to click on this define action section below for the on click. And when I define the action, I want to execute a query. The query I want to execute is on MongoDB and specifically the create new ticket query. And now I can bind each of the fields to my form. So customer name, I'll click the lightning bolt, I'll click create new ticket, and that should be customer name, and save. Issue, create new ticket, issue. I just need to work down each of the fields, clicking on the lightning bolt, and matching it to the correct field in my form. Click save. So I'll click on preview, and we'll try that out. So say customer was Budibase, issue, creating a create ticket, resolved by me, Kevin, start time, I'll say now, and end time then, resolution, create it, and status closed. I'll click add. And now I want to check that's actually got to my data layer. So I'll go to my data, go to get all tickets. I'll just run this query again and just make sure that this ticket has been added. And you can see here, Budibase created Kevin now. Great, that's worked fine. Okay, so we've created a single record. Now we want to be able to read all our records. To do that, I'm going to add a data provider, access all of our data. We call this all tickets. The data it's going to get it from is get all tickets. Inside of there, create another component called a table. And straight away, we've got all the data from our query. I can click on the table, click on configure columns, add all columns, and save. And it clears up some of those automated columns. And I just get a nicer table here. I'm going to rename this table so it's all tickets table so that I can see what's going on the left-hand side here. So I've got my create at the top and my read down below. What I'd like to happen now is when I click on a single record, I'd like it to pop over and show me a form with those things built into it. So I'm going to add, under my data provider, I'm going to add a side panel. And this side panel is going to be called update ticket. And I effectively want a copy of my create new ticket in there. So I'm going to copy this, click inside of my update ticket and paste it in there. And I'm just going to change some things. I want to update ticket. This is going to be an update operation, and I want to use the update one ticket schema to be able to manage that. So all the fields are going to be the same, but we want their value to be set based on the clicked row of our table. So I'm going to click on my table, and here I can see on row click, what actions do we want? So I'm going to define those actions. And there are a couple of things I would like to happen. If I scroll down here, there's an update field value, which allows me to select a form. Now, my form is not selectable here, so I'm going to need to change the structure a little bit. I'm going to move my ticket up one layer, so my form is now outside of my dropdown. I'm going to move my table inside of my form, and now I'll move each of the fields and the heading inside to the side panel. So let's do that now. The structure I have now, I've got my data provider, I've got my update ticket form containing my table, and that's so my table has awareness of the ticket form, so it's able to update things inside it. And then I've got the fields that are inside this, nested inside this side panel, so it can be brought out or put away again. So clicking back into the table, on row click, define the actions, and we want to update field value. Which form? The update ticket form. What do we want to do? We want to set the value. We want to set the value of the customer name. And what do we want to set it to? Well, if we click the lightning bolt, we can see we can click into the table and to the clicked row. We want the customer name to match the clicked row customer name. So we need to do that for each of the fields. Add action, update field value, select the form, select the field, hit the lightning bolt, table, clicked row, dot, and the field name. I'm going to do that for all the rest of them now. And once the data has been set, the last action we want to do is we want to show the side panel. So we'll open side panel. Which side panel? The update ticket one, and we'll save. So let's preview that. We have our create at the top. We have our form here. If I click on this, it pops out, it's Kevin, start times now, end times then, status is closed, all the rest of that. I click on another one, they are the correct records that are happening. So we have creating a new record up here. We have reading all the records in the table, and we've reading an individual record on the left-hand side in this panel. But actually, we're almost there for our update as well, because now we can just reconfigure the side panel so that when we press this button, it updates the status. So this should be update new ticket, update ticket. And our button should say update ticket. Our actions, instead of executing the create new ticket, this should be update one ticket. The binding should be largely the same, except we should also have the ID. And where are we going to get the ID from? So the button doesn't have a binding for the table. So what I'm going to do is back on my table, I'm going to add another action here. And the action I'm going to do is I'm going to set a state value. So I'll update state, I'll set a value, and I'll give it a key. I'll call this the selected ticket. And the value here will be the selected ticket dot ID, underscore ID, remember, because it's coming from MongoDB. So I'll save that. So now on my update ticket button, my define actions, my update one ticket, I can set the ID to the state value of selected ticket and save that. Let's see how we do. So if I click on this ticket, I'll change the status to reopened and click on update. It says query executed successfully. If I click out, it says closed still here, but if I refresh the page, it's going to say reopened. So there are two things I'd like to do. The first is I'd like this panel to be closed when I click this button. And the second is I would like the data to be refreshed. So the first, closing, on the update button, I'll define another action and we'll just look for side panel, close side panel and save. That's it. That bit's done. The other thing I want this to do is to refresh the data provider. Refresh data provider. Which data provider? The all tickets one. And I'll save. If I preview now, try again. Got my table. I realize I've resolved by Kevin. It should really be my made up ID, tech123, update. the panel goes away and the data has been refreshed. The table is showing the live data. So we've created, we've read, we've updated, and the last thing really is delete. I should click inside of here and I should have maybe a delete button up here. So let's implement that. So my update ticket, this headline, I'm going to put it in a container. I'll call it the heading container. I'll put the update ticket inside it along with a button. I'll set it to grid row rather than grid column. I'll call this the delete button. I'll set this variant to warning because I want it to be read, and I'll set define actions. I want to execute a query on the MongoDB, specifically the delete one ticket. I do want to require notification here. Are you sure you want to delete this record? And we need a binding for the ID, and that's going to be in our state variable. So lightning bolt, state, selected ticket, and save. So we can create a record with our form. We can click on a record and edit it and read it, and we can now delete it. So click on delete button. Are you sure you want to delete this record? Click on confirm. It's been executed successfully. But two things we've forgotten to do: close the panel and update the data source. So let's go do that. And we press this button, delete button, one action, execute the query. We want to close the panel and refresh the data provider, save, and last time then. We now have two records in our database, Budibase and Acme Core. Let's delete our Acme Core. We're going to click on delete button. Are you sure you want to delete this record? Confirm. That's been closed and it's been removed from our data source. We could tidy this up a bit more, maybe sticking the create new ticket in a side panel. Let's try that. And its action should be to open the side panel, and our create new user button now should have another action to close the panel. And there we have it. We can create a new record. We can read all the records or read an individual record. We can update an individual record, and we can delete an individual record. You can now build similar applications for any data that you have stored in MongoDB, such as customer details, staff support details, and so on. We could also add more features, more data validation, more user authentication, and integration with other systems like our email system or some other API that might be in this workflow. Budibase allows us to provide some structure around our unstructured data in order to make it more actionable and available to our users in the shop floor and in the office. Good luck with using these skills to turn your data into action.